In a video I posted earlier about Stephen Miller's recent comments, I realized that I made the comment that I believe that the Trump, Stephen Miller, and members of his administration are, I think, heavily influenced by 19th and 20th century eugenics and ideas that underlie scientific racism. And I realized this is a big accusation, so I need to point towards the trend that I believe signifies this. Realized I hadn't put out my notes on any of that, and I've said it quite a few times, so I wanted to take just a few minutes to put out a quick video where I outline why I believe that scientific racism and eugenics thinking are alive and well in the Trump administration and are a major factor in the rhetoric and attitudes and plan that they have for immigration and other social policies. When you go back and you look at the rhetoric, there is a consistent pattern that stems across both Trump administrations with statements made by Trump in public and members of his administration that echo themes that are historically associated with eugenics, scientific racism, and biological determinism of the 19th and 20th century. Now, to be clear, I am not making the argument that the administration has formally adopted eugenics policies of the early 20th century. This would be forced sterilization programs, stuff like that. They are moving towards the revival of institutionalization, which is tied to it, though. The more historically accurate argument is that certain rhetorical patterns utilized by Trump and his advisors, like Stephen Miller, resemble ideas that were central to the eugenics era thinking. And that is the belief that certain elements of human behavior, intelligence, morality, criminality, and social worth are determined by inherited biological traits, and that these beliefs show up very prominently in the administration's narratives on immigration and other cultural issues. For those of you who don't know, the eugenics movement in the 19th and 20th century was built on the idea that society could be improved by controlling who belonged, who reproduced, and who was allowed to enter a nation. These ideas went on to fuel ideas that drove mass murder and Nazism later on, and also institutional cruelty. Eugenicists argued that traits such as criminality, poverty, alcoholism, and moral weakness were in fact hereditary. And I've met modern Christian nationalists who have told me these same ideas, so they still exist. These ideas helped justify policies of forced sterilization, racial segregation, restrictive immigration laws like we saw under Calvin Coolidge, which was the Immigration Act of 1924, which Stephen Miller loves, by the way, which would go on to influence these theories about preserving a quality of the American population. One of the clearest examples of this type of rhetoric comes from a 2024 interview that Trump did with radio personality Hugh Hewitt. And they're talking about certain behaviors, and Trump actually says, now a murderer, I believe this, it's in their genes. And we got a lot of bad genes in our country right now. Okay, so he says he believes that murderers' propensity is genetic. Okay? The significance of this statement is not simply that Trump simply criticized criminals. Leaders have always discussed crime. The historically important element is that the explanation that Trump gives is that criminality is something inherited biologically. It is a genetic default in certain portions of the population. Now, this reflects a central idea of early eugenics, that social problems are caused by defective populations rather than by complex social, economic, and environmental factors. So this is just one part. Trump has also repeatedly used language about inherited superiority of certain genetics. At a 2020 rally in Minnesota, Trump told supporters, he would go on to say, he says, "You have good genes. You know that, right? a lot of it is about genes, isn't it? Okay? And in that same speech, he goes on to reference the racehorse theory, comparing human qualities to traits selectively bred in animals. And this is important because historically, especially through the 20th century, eugenicists would frequently use animal breeding as a model for human society, how to breed out the bad genetics to get your best performance out of animal husbandry. And this was taken and applied to human populations to the detriment and death of many people. They argued that desirable traits should be encouraged amongst fit populations, while undesirable traits should be reduced among unfit populations by selective breeding, forced sterilizations, and other things to weed out bad populations. So the language of good genes creates a hierarchy where some people are implicitly viewed as biologically superiors, while other populations or individuals are viewed as biologically deficient. It is a scientifically illiterate view of human genetics, but it still persists, and Trump echoes it. In another rally, Trump went on to talk about immigration, and he stated that immigrants from all over the world are, quote, poisoning the blood of our country. Now, this comment represents another historically significant eugenicist and biological determinist theme, that blood and contamination are metaphors that have long been used by racial and nationalist movements to describe demographic changes as a biological threat. This language closely resembles arguments made by prominent 20th century figures in the eugenics movements like Madison Grant. In 1916, Madison Grant wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race, which argued that race was tied to heredity and that immigration threatened the quality of the nation's population. Now, that is Stephen Miller's position. That is directly his position because he has cited the ideas of the Immigration Act of 1924, which echoed these sentiments. Now, in this book, a very close friend of Dr. Grant, a man by the name of Dr. Henry Fairfield Osborne, wrote the following quote. He says, "Race has played a far larger part than either language or nationality in the molding of the destinies of men. Race implies heredity, and heredity implies all the moral, social, and intellectual characteristics and traits which are the springs of politics and government." He goes on to say, "The conservation of that race which has given us the true spirit of Americanism is not a matter of either racial pride or racial prejudice, but is a matter of love and country." Now, this concept of the true spirit of Americanism was also an element in the social messaging of the Ku Klux Klan in their war and in their campaign of terror across the American South against integration. Osborne would later go on to co-found an organization called the American Eugenics Society in 1926 and organize the International Eugenics Conference in 1921. In addition to all of this, Trump also stated during a Fox News appearance where he was talking about immigration again, and he says, quote, "Their genetics are not exactly your genetics. It's one of those problems," end quote. This statement, again, shifts immigration from a question of policy, of economics, or law into a question of inherited biological difference tied to his idea of certain populations being genetically different from others, superior versus inferior. Scientific racism has historically relied on the belief that different populations possess different inherent biological qualities. And I actually had a white nationalist who I know personally in a Facebook conversation talk about this specific thing. So this is still a common idea even now. Modern genetics rejects the idea that racial categories correspond to a hierarchy of human ability, morality, or worth. These themes also connect to the rhetoric of Stephen Miller, one of Trump's primary architects for his immigration policies. Now, Miller is kind of this weird background-dwelling individual some of the time, in that he has generally avoided explicit genetic language publicly. But people have noticed and argued that his arguments often rely on themes historically associated with nativism and scientific racism. He ties all this to demographic decline, to cultural replacement, and the need to preserve a very specific national identity. And in leaked emails that were published in 2019, he openly praises racist efforts like the immigration policy of 1924, where he talked about this at length. Other emails published in 2019 find that he promoted immigration restriction material and sources associated with a variety of nationalist and anti-immigration movements. His rhetoric has frequently emphasized fears about demographic transformation, the Great Replacement idea, and the idea that immigration threatens the character of the nation. In the video I just posted, which was a full breakdown of Miller's recent speech, his comments about political opponents also demonstrate another historically important pattern, okay? In discussing Antifa and Antifa protesters, he went on to say that none of the people that are protesting look like a normal person. Not one looks normal. They're all deformed in some way. In their appearance, he says. In their dress, he says. In their mannerisms, he says. So he's tying this idea of someone's appearance being an indicator of their inner capabilities. He continued, their outer appearance becomes a manifestation of their inner hatred. Okay? Now, this reflects a very long and very ignoble tradition of physiognomic thinking. I can't pronounce the word. I apologize. It's on the screen. This is the belief that a person's physical appearance reveals their inner moral character, okay? That you can identify by certain physical traits someone's personality. In the 19th and early 20th century, figures such as Cesar Lombroso argued that criminals could be identified through certain inherited physical characteristics tied to their genetics. Now, modern science has rejected these ideas, but the rhetorical pattern remains historically recognizable, and Miller absolutely has carried on that specific idea in the way he categorizes his political opposition. In this speech, Miller repeatedly contrasts what he draws lines of as normal, as healthy, as beautiful, and ordered people versus the deformed, abnormal, and dangerous people. Also resembles language of what was called degeneration theory. And this was an idea in the 19th century that racial and eugenic thought. It was very much tied to all of this. This connects to the propagation of the Great Replacement theory, which is very common right now amongst white nationalists and other groups, which argues that native populations are being replaced by immigrants through demographic change. And this person I was speaking to, they would never make this argument, but they would always use the term our people this, our people that, our people aren't reproducing enough. Historically, eugenicists expressed similar fears that supposedly superior populations would be overwhelmed by supposedly inferior populations. Now, if you look at Trump's statements, they're poisoning the blood. They've got bad genes. Murder propensity is in genetics, or their genetics are not your genetics. This is all Great Replacement theory, and it's all coming from the president and his office. Now, the modern version of these eugenics and scientific determinist arguments rest more often on language about culture and demographics and civilization rather than explicit biology or genetics. However, when combined with references to genes, to blood, and inherited traits, I argue that the underlying framework very, very explicitly resembles the older forms of scientific racism, and that those forms of scientific racism are openly influencing the nation's immigration policy and its attitudes towards certain other ideas. When these statements are examined together, a very consistent pattern emerges. Trump says bad genes and suggests that criminality is inherited. He says good genes and suggests that some populations are superior via inherited traits. He says that immigration is poisoning the blood of our nation, which suggests a demographic change in the form of contamination. He says that immigrant genetics is not your genetics, different genetics, which suggests that groups are biologically distinct and therefore need to be taken into consideration. Stephen Miller uses normal versus deformed to suggest that physical appearance reveals moral and social and cultural worth or cultural threat. The concern raised by historians throughout the history of eugenics and civil rights scholars all the way down and through is not that every immigration restriction or argument is automatically eugenic. The concern is that the rhetoric changes when political opponents or immigrant groups are no longer described simply as people with different cultures or different ideas or backgrounds, but as a biologically different, a biologically defective, a biological contaminant, or inherently dangerous group of people as a broad brush definition. The history of the 19th and 20th century shows that ideas about good populations, about bad populations, about national decline, and biological threats to national identity have often provided the intellectual foundation for extraordinarily punitive, exclusionary movements. And that is why the president's language about genetics, about blood, about hereditary, and human worth deserve very careful examination whenever it enters the political discourse. The fact that these things have been gone on for so long and nobody on the political right has picked up on the fact that these ideas have very poisonous antecedents is very disturbing. It is also important to understand that these ideas have historically connected with white nationalism. Eugenics provided the pseudo-scientific framework for white nationalist movements by claiming that human populations could be ranked basically according to inherited genetic ideas, all right, or traits, and that national strength depended upon preserving the dominance of a supposedly superior group, all right? And you still, like I said, you still see this now. Now, while modern white nationalist groups or movements often avoid the explicit language of the 20th century racial science, you get groups like your Patriot Front and groups like that that recently came out and said that they were a persecuted group and they needed to protect national identity. Many of these people still rely on these concepts. Fears of demographic replacement, claims that culture and identity are biologically rooted, and that the belief that some groups are naturally better suited to lead or belong in a national body than others. Although these ideas have been thoroughly debunked by modern genetic science, modern social science, they do, however, remain to be very, very powerful tools in political mobilization because they transform social and political disagreements into questions of identity politics over who belongs, who has power, who has authority, and more importantly, who has the right to set the concept of what an American or a community member actually is. They're also tied to the concepts of identity survival. So by portraying immigration, cultural change, or political opposition as biological social threats rather than as policy agreements, these narratives, these eugenic ideas, create fear, they justify exclusion, and reinforce social prejudices as a means of political power. So since really the first days of the first Trump administration, many of these themes have become visible in mainstream political rhetoric. Okay, like I said, tied directly back to the statements of the president himself. Good genes, bad genes, poisoning the blood, Genetic differences between populations and fears of demographic replacement have helped bring ideas that were once confined to the graveyard of human thought to once again being back into prominence. And but these ideas are largely confined to extremist movements on the border of political conversations, which is where they belong. They belong on the fringe. But critics will argue that figures such as Donald Trump or Stephen Miller or Douglas Wilson or Pete Hegseth, all of these people who have kind of amplified various elements of these ideas by presenting them as explanations for social problems, even though the scientific foundations behind them have long since been discredited as bad science and bad social racism from the 19th and 20th century. They belong in the dustbin of human ideas. The historical lesson is that these pseudoscientific ideas about human hierarchy do not remain harmless past theories. When governments and political movements adopt this kind of language that divides people into healthy and unhealthy, wanted and unwanted, threatening and non-threatening, belonging and non-belonging populations, desirable or undesirable groups, criminal-minded or not criminal-minded, however you want to see it. Those who belong and those who threaten the nation, those ideas become powerful tools for institutionalizing prejudice, which we are seeing more and more and more of.